The machine started failing 3 days after I stopped staying late. Not catastrophically. That would have been easier for leadership to understand. The failures began quietly. Small delays, slower diagnostics, maintenance tickets sitting unanswered for 6 hours instead of 20 minutes. Conveyor synchronization drifting just enough to force overnight recalibration windows. Tiny fractures, invisible to executives, expensive to everyone else. My name is Preston Hale. I am 40 years old, a former United States Army Staff Sergeant, and for 8 years I managed operational systems inside Blackridge Defense Manufacturing outside Tacoma, Washington. Officially, I was an operations manager. Unofficially, I was the bridge holding the entire facility together. The company built targeting assemblies and navigation hardware for military transport systems. Everything inside the plant depended on timing precision, robotics, mechanical sequencing, software diagnostics, federal compliance reporting. Most executives saw separate departments. I saw dependency chains. That was the difference. For years I stayed late almost every night fixing problems before leadership even knew they existed. I rewrote broken maintenance escalations quietly, stabilized machine drift manually during surge contracts, translated software failures into language exhausted mechanics could actually use at 2 in the morning. Nobody asked me to. That was the dangerous part. The company stopped seeing the difference between dedication and structural dependence. Then came the promotion review. Thursday morning. Executive conference room. Frosted glass walls overlooking Building 2. Rain sliding across the factory windows while production lines moved beneath cold industrial lighting 3 floors below. Evan Mercer sat across from me, wearing a tailored Navy suit and the kind of confidence business schools manufacture in bulk. 34 years old. Harvard Master of Business Administration. Fast-tracked into senior leadership after less than 18 months inside defense manufacturing. He liked phrases more than systems. Scalability, modernization, leadership optics. He used those words constantly. The promotion should have been automatic. Everyone on the operations floor knew it. Even the supervisors already treated me like senior leadership unofficially because they understood who stabilized the building when pressure climbed. But Evan smiled carefully before speaking. Preston, your operational value is undeniable. But leadership today requires broader strategic vision. Corporate translation. You are useful, not promotable. I stayed quiet. Army discipline teaches you something important early. The moment emotional people think they control your reactions, they stop revealing themselves honestly. So I let him continue. He explained that the company needed leaders with modern executive perspective, data-driven adaptability, organizational scalability mindset. Then he recommended a younger management analyst for the senior operations role instead. A 29-year-old consultant who once asked me whether hydraulic drift alarms were software notifications or mechanical errors. That meeting lasted 11 minutes. 8 years reduced to leadership vocabulary. Interesting thing about corporate arrogance. It usually sounds calm right before the damage begins. I thanked him for the feedback. Stood up, shook his hand, returned to the production floor. No argument, no confrontation. That confused him more than anger would have. Because executives expect resistance from the people carrying invisible weight. They do not expect discipline. At exactly 5:03 that evening, I left the building on schedule for the first time in almost 6 years. No overtime, no unofficial support, no after-hours diagnostics. The overnight supervisor stopped me near the maintenance corridor before I reached the exit. You heading out already? I nodded once. Shift ended. He stared at me silently for a second because everyone inside that building knew something leadership did not. The factory behaved differently after I left. By Friday morning, maintenance escalation queues doubled. By Saturday night, a surge calibration delay forced a 6-hour production slowdown across Building 3. And by Sunday afternoon, the first defense contract shipment missed its outbound timing window by 37 minutes. That had never happened before. Not once. Somewhere inside the executive offices upstairs, Evan Mercer was probably still explaining operational stability using presentation slides while the machinery underneath him slowly drifted out of rhythm, one unresolved failure at a time. And the terrifying part was simple. I had not sabotaged anything. I had only stopped protecting the company from the consequences of ignoring me. If you are watching this from somewhere outside Washington tonight, comment your city below. Because what happened next nearly cost Blackridge Defense one of the largest military contracts in the Pacific Northwest. The maintenance corridors sounded different after midnight. Slower, more uncertain. I noticed it Monday night while walking through Building 3 exactly at the end of my scheduled shift. Hydraulic compressors hissed unevenly beneath fluorescent lighting, while two junior technicians stood beside an inactive calibration unit flipping through printed troubleshooting manuals thick enough to stop a door. Normally, I would have fixed the issue in 10 minutes. Not anymore. One of them looked up when he saw me approaching. Relief crossed his face immediately. Then confusion replaced it. Because I kept walking. "Preston, do you know why the thermal alignment sequence keeps rejecting the sync load?" I stopped beside the machine quietly. Reviewed the error code once. Same problem from 6 months earlier. Mechanical drift tolerance mismatch after surge production cycling. Simple fix. If you knew the undocumented workaround. I pointed toward the manual binder resting open across the maintenance cart. Section 14.7 covers synchronization recovery. The younger technician blinked twice. That section is almost 300 pages. I nodded once. Then I left the building. No anger. No performance. Just procedure. That was the moment people inside Blackridge Defense finally started understanding the difference between official process and invisible labor. For years, I translated complexity into speed. Not because policy required it. Because operational survival depended on someone bridging the gaps between departments too disconnected to communicate properly under pressure. Leadership called that teamwork. The factory called it Preston. By Tuesday afternoon, the unresolved maintenance queue doubled again. Calibration delays spread into secondary production sequencing, while software diagnostics teams blamed mechanical response lag, and mechanics blamed automation timing conflicts they barely understood. Nobody recognized the real issue yet. The systems were still functioning, but the human bridge coordinating them quietly had stopped overcompensating for everyone else. Inside the executive operations meeting upstairs, Evan Mercer projected confidence like a man presenting quarterly growth slides instead of overseeing industrial drift inside a defense contractor facility. Lena Park sat near the end of the conference table reviewing overnight escalation reports silently, while department heads debated operational slowdowns using increasingly defensive language. Temporary bottlenecks. Adjustment period. Workflow normalization. Interesting vocabulary. Executives rename problems constantly hoping softer language reduces consequences. Then the production director finally asked the obvious question. Why are small failures taking 4 times longer to resolve suddenly? Nobody answered immediately, because everyone inside the room already suspected the answer. They just did not want to say my name out loud yet. Evan leaned back calmly beneath recessed conference lighting. The organization became overdependent on legacy workflows. We are modernizing operational accountability structures now. Wrong diagnosis. The factory was not dependent on legacy workflows. It was dependent on undocumented judgment. Huge difference. At 6:30 Wednesday morning, another shipment delay triggered automatic compliance review flags tied to military contract timing thresholds. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to generate attention from federal oversight auditors monitoring production reliability metrics remotely. Bad development. Government contracts tolerate mistakes. They do not tolerate instability patterns, especially not inside defense manufacturing. Meanwhile, I followed my schedule precisely for the first time in years. Morning inspections, operations review, shift coordination, documentation approvals, then departure exactly on time. The supervisors stopped asking me to stay late after Wednesday, not because they stopped needing help, because they finally realized I was done volunteering pieces of my life to protect executives who confused sacrifice with weakness. Thursday night, the robotic synchronization team attempted a full recalibration cycle without waiting for mechanical balancing verification first. The results spread through Building 2 within minutes. Conveyor pacing slowed unevenly while sensor arrays started rejecting alignment sequencing automatically across 3 production lanes. Nothing exploded. Real factories rarely fail dramatically. They drift. That is what makes them dangerous. One exhausted systems engineer finally called my personal phone around 11:15 that night, while I sat alone on my apartment balcony overlooking Commencement Bay beneath cold Pacific Northwest rain. "Preston, nobody can stabilize the sequencing. We have been here 7 hours already." I stayed quiet for a moment, listening to distant foghorns moving through the harbor darkness. Then I answered calmly, "Did you follow the documented escalation process?" Long silence, because both of us understood the truth immediately. The documented process was never enough. That was why I existed in the first place. But for the first time in 8 years, Blackridge Defense was finally experiencing what their systems looked like without someone silently carrying the operational weight leadership refused to see. The first federal warning arrived Thursday afternoon. Quietly. That is how serious oversight usually begins inside defense manufacturing. No screaming. No dramatic confrontation. Just a compliance notification buried beneath operational language most executives ignore until lawyers start attending meetings. Blackridge Defense missed another synchronization threshold tied to shipment consistency metrics across 2 active Army transport component contracts. The delay itself was minor. 41 minutes. The pattern was not. Patterns attract attention, especially from the Department of Defense. Inside the executive conference room, Evan Mercer still behaved like the situation remained manageable through leadership positioning and process optimization language. The production dashboards behind him glowed red beneath dim recessed lighting, while exhausted department supervisors reviewed overnight escalation summaries with the emotional energy of people already losing confidence in management. Lena Park sat motionless near the far side of the table, reviewing maintenance data chronologically instead of emotionally. Smart move. Reality becomes clearer once timelines replace opinions. Evan tapped the presentation screen calmly. The organization relied too heavily on individual operational dependency. We are transitioning towards scalable leadership systems now. There it was again. Scalable. Executives love that word because it sounds intelligent during meetings. Factories hate that word because machines do not care about leadership vocabulary. They care about timing, pressure tolerances, calibration sequences, and people experienced enough to interpret unstable behavior before failures spread. The senior mechanical supervisor finally interrupted him. With respect, none of these delays existed 3 weeks ago. Evan adjusted his cuff slowly before answering. Correlation does not equal causation. Wrong room for business school phrases. Nobody on the production side looked impressed anymore. Because operational employees measure truth differently. Things either work or they do not. By Friday morning, the maintenance escalation queue reached levels nobody inside Blackridge had seen in years. Hydraulic synchronization drift. Thermal cycling inconsistencies. Robotics latency spikes during surge transitions. Small failures. Constant failures. That combination drains organizations faster than major disasters because it destroys rhythm. And factories survive on rhythm. At 10:17 that morning, I walked through Building 2 during routine inspections while technicians avoided eye contact awkwardly around me. Not resentment. Recognition. They understood what leadership still refused to admit openly. The systems had not become more broken. They had become more exposed. One younger automation engineer stopped me near the diagnostics corridor, holding a tablet filled with unresolved calibration logs. "Preston, can I ask something honestly?" I nodded once. "Were you really fixing this many issues personally every week?" I looked past him toward the production floor, where robotic transport arms moved slightly out of timing beneath fluorescent factory light. Tiny hesitation. Tiny drift. Tiny instability. Then I answered carefully. Most of the time, I prevented the issues from becoming visible. His expression changed immediately, because that sentence terrified him more than any system failure report possibly could. By Friday evening, Lena Park completed a cross-department escalation review nobody upstairs expected to become important. She mapped overtime response patterns against operational stability metrics across the previous 24 months. The correlation was brutal. Every major stabilization event connected directly to undocumented after-hours intervention from me personally. Manual balancing. Emergency coordination. Cross-team translation. Audit preparation. Compliance recovery. Invisible labor everywhere. Lena printed the report instead of emailing it. Smart decision again. Sensitive truths feel heavier once executives hold physical pages in silence. At 7:42, she placed the file directly in front of Evan Mercer during the evening operations review. He scanned the first few pages casually, then slower, then completely stopped talking. The room tightened immediately, because for the first time since this started, leadership encountered measurable proof that the organization depended structurally on work never appearing inside official reporting systems. Evan finally looked up toward the operations directors surrounding the table. Why was this never formally documented? Nobody answered right away. Not because they lacked answers. Because the real answers sounded terrible. The company never documented the dependence because leadership benefited financially from pretending the system required fewer people than it actually did. Interesting thing about invisible labor. Organizations love it while it remains invisible. Then they panic the moment it disappears. Around 11:30 Friday night, my phone rang again while I cleaned an old Army field watch sitting disassembled across my kitchen table beneath soft apartment lighting. Different caller this time. Evan Mercer personally. I let the phone ring 4 times before answering. His voice sounded thinner already, less polished. Preston, we need to discuss operational continuity support temporarily. Not an apology. Not respect. Support. I leaned back quietly in my chair listening to rain move against the apartment windows overlooking Tacoma Harbor. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Am I leadership material now? The silence afterward lasted almost 8 full seconds. The production floor turned red at 2:13 Saturday morning. Not metaphorically. Actual warning lights. Long rows of emergency indicators flashing across Building 3 while exhausted technicians moved between stalled transport assemblies beneath cold industrial haze and hydraulic heat. A surge production cycle had collapsed halfway through sequencing synchronization. 3 robotic lanes froze automatically after conflicting timing signals triggered safety lockouts inside the conveyor network. The systems were protecting themselves from deeper damage. Smart machines. Smarter than leadership. Inside the factory, alarms sounded in uneven intervals while maintenance crews argued across open radio channels trying to isolate the root problem fast enough to prevent federal shipment violations before sunrise. Nobody could stabilize the pacing sequence. Because the real issue was never software alone, or mechanics alone. It lived in the invisible space between both systems. That had always been my territory. At 2:41, the night supervisor called my phone again. Then the senior production manager. Then another engineer from Building 2. I answered none of them. Not from bitterness. From boundaries. Big difference. For 8 years, Blackridge Defense trained itself to rely on unlimited emergency access to my judgment while refusing to acknowledge the structural risk that created. Now the bill arrived. By dawn, the stalled production window triggered automatic federal contract review escalation tied to defense fulfillment reliability thresholds. One delayed shipment becomes paperwork. Multiple delays become oversight attention. And oversight attention inside military manufacturing spreads fast. At 7:15 Saturday morning, every executive parking spot outside headquarters was occupied already. Rain covered the asphalt while exhausted department heads rushed through security entrances carrying laptops, binders, and the facial expressions of people realizing spreadsheets do not repair physical systems. Meanwhile, I followed routine. Gym at 6. Coffee afterward. Quiet apartment. No panic. Army discipline teaches emotional compartmentalization early. You do not absorb chaos simply because other people failed preparation. At 9:31, Evan Mercer finally sent a formal email requesting emergency operational consultation support under temporary contract compensation. Interesting wording again. Still no apology. Still avoiding the real issue. Respect. I reviewed the message once while sitting beside my kitchen window overlooking gray Tacoma waterfront clouds drifting low above the harbor cranes. Then I closed the laptop without replying immediately. Not tactical manipulation. Clarity. Leadership needed to understand something important before this situation continued escalating. The company was not suffering because I stopped helping emotionally. The company was suffering because executives built operational strategy around unpaid dependency while pretending it was sustainable management. Around noon, Lena Park entered the executive crisis meeting carrying another printed report. Different file this time. Federal contract exposure analysis. Potential penalties. Escalation pathways. Military oversight contact structures. The atmosphere inside the room reportedly changed immediately once she explained how many compliance timelines depended indirectly on stable production rhythm across the exact systems currently drifting toward failure. Evan interrupted her halfway through. Can we recover before this reaches Army procurement review? Lena paused carefully before answering. Not without operational stabilization authority. Not enough words, but enough truth. Because everyone inside the room understood what operational stabilization authority actually meant. Me. The irony became almost cinematic by Saturday evening. The same leadership team that called my methods outdated 4 days earlier now spent 14 straight hours desperately trying to recreate undocumented knowledge they never respected enough to formalize properly. By 6:42, another synchronization collapse hit Building 2 during attempted recovery sequencing. Smaller than the overnight failure. More dangerous politically, because now the instability pattern looked systemic. And systemic instability attracts federal attention much faster than isolated failure ever does. At 8:17, my phone rang again. Different number. Washington, District of Columbia area code. I answered calmly. A measured, older voice introduced himself as Colonel Raymond Davis, Defense Contract Management Agency representative overseeing portions of the military logistics contracts tied to Blackridge Defense production timelines. No wasted words. Military officers rarely need many. Mr. Hale, I understand you managed operational coordination previously. Previously. Interesting choice. I leaned back slowly in silence while rain struck the apartment windows harder against the darkening Tacoma skyline. Then the colonel continued. The company leadership informs us you are no longer directly involved in stabilization operations. I answered carefully. That is correct, Colonel. Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed the entire balance of power permanently. Mr. Hale, I believe leadership may have underestimated what exactly you were holding together over there. By Sunday morning, the factory sounded exhausted. Not broken. Exhausted. There is a difference experienced operators recognize immediately. Broken systems stop moving. Exhausted systems keep functioning while quietly drifting closer toward irreversible failure, one compromise cycle at a time. Inside Building 3, the conveyor pacing had become uneven enough that technicians started compensating manually between sequencing intervals just to maintain minimum shipment timing compliance. Dangerous practice. Temporary fixes create invisible debt. And invisible debt always comes due eventually. At 8:06 Sunday morning, the executive crisis team assembled again beneath pale conference room lighting, while outside the production campus rain washed across empty loading docks lined with delayed military transport crates waiting for outbound clearance. Nobody looked polished anymore. Evan Mercer especially. His tie hung loose. His jaw tightened constantly while he reviewed overnight escalation reports spreading across the conference table like battlefield damage assessments. The language inside those reports had changed noticeably over the previous 48 hours. Not optimization. Not transition. Exposure. Instability, compliance risk, systemic dependency. Reality was entering the room finally. Lena Park placed another document beside Evan carefully. A federal notification requesting immediate operational clarification regarding recurring synchronization inconsistencies tied to Blackridge Defense contract fulfillment performance. The room fell silent again. Because military oversight asking questions is survivable. Military oversight repeating questions is career-ending territory. One operations director rubbed both hands across his face slowly before speaking. How long before this escalates beyond internal review? Nobody answered immediately. Then Lena did. It already has. Cold sentence. Accurate sentence. Around the same time, I drove 30 miles south toward an outdoor shooting range outside Olympia, where I usually spent Sunday mornings resetting mentally after high-pressure production cycles. Gray clouds hung low across the tree line, while distant gunfire echoed softly through wet Pacific Northwest air. Discipline matters during chaos, especially emotional discipline, because panic makes executives reactive. Stillness makes leverage visible. My phone remained silent until almost noon. Then it vibrated 3 times within less than 10 minutes. First, Evan Mercer. Then the Senior Vice President of Operations. Then Colonel Raymond Davis directly. I answered only the colonel. His voice sounded flatter this time. Less observational. More strategic. Mr. Hale, Blackridge leadership informs me the operational situation continues deteriorating despite internal recovery efforts. I loaded another magazine slowly before answering. That aligns with what I expected, Colonel. Small pause. Then he asked the real question finally. Did they fully understand your role before denying your promotion request? Interesting phrasing again. not your employment, your role. Because experienced military leadership understands something corporate executives often miss completely. Titles mean very little inside operational environments. Functional dependency means everything. I answered honestly. No, Colonel. They understood output. They never understood stabilization. Silence followed briefly over the line while wind moved through wet evergreens surrounding the range facility. Then his voice lowered slightly. That is becoming very obvious now. Back inside Blackridge Defense, another overnight synchronization failure triggered secondary inspection, holds across multiple outgoing shipments. Not catastrophic individually, but collectively the delays started threatening contract reliability, scoring tied directly to future federal allocation reviews. Money pressure changes executive behavior fast. Federal money pressure changes it even faster. By late afternoon, Evan finally did something leadership personalities hate doing publicly. He walked onto the production floor himself. No conference room, no presentation screen, just concrete flooring, hydraulic noise, warning indicators, exhausted supervisors, and frustrated technicians surrounded by unstable sequencing equipment leadership barely understood. Reality looks different without polished office lighting. One senior mechanic reportedly handed Evan a diagnostics tablet during the walkthrough and asked a simple question. Who handles this now? Evan stared at the screen several seconds too long before answering. That hesitation spread through the floor faster than any formal announcement possibly could. Because operational workers measure competence instantly. And once confidence disappears inside industrial environments, authority starts collapsing quietly underneath management structures. At 7:22 Sunday evening, my apartment buzzer rang unexpectedly. Not a phone call this time. A visitor. I opened the door calmly. Lena Park stood outside holding a sealed federal compliance folder against her coat, while rainwater dripped quietly from the edge of the stairwell behind her. She looked directly at me for several seconds before speaking. The Army Oversight Office requested a private operational assessment tomorrow morning. Then she handed me the folder carefully. And for the first time since all of this started, I realized the company was no longer trying to protect its executives. It was trying to survive them. Monday morning smelled like overheated circuitry and burnt hydraulic oil. Not catastrophic yet. Worse, controlled deterioration. The kind that forces organizations into exhausting survival mode while leadership pretends recovery remains possible through meetings and motivational language. I arrived at the Federal Oversight Office in downtown Tacoma at 8:23 beneath low gray skies rolling across the harbor. The building itself looked sterile and forgettable from outside. Neutral concrete, dark glass, minimal signage. Government architecture rarely wastes energy trying to impress people. Inside the third-floor conference room, Colonel Raymond Davis sat beside two civilian contract auditors reviewing operational summaries spread neatly across the table. No hostility, no theatrics, only assessment. That felt familiar. Military environments reward clarity over performance. The colonel motioned toward the chair across from him. Mr. Hale, we are trying to determine whether the current instability reflects temporary organizational disruption or structural operational dependency. Important distinction. One creates delays. The other threatens contract confidence. I reviewed the production reports quietly before answering. Maintenance backlog escalation. Sequencing drift frequency. Recovery timing failures. Audit exposure warnings. Everything aligned exactly where I expected. Not because I caused the instability. Because I understood the architecture leadership ignored. One auditor leaned forward slightly. Are the systems themselves defective? I shook my head once. No. The systems are operating exactly as designed. That answer confused him briefly. Then the colonel understood immediately. The problem is operational integration. I nodded. Finally, someone upstairs spoke the correct language. For years, Blackridge Defense built efficiency projections around the assumption that undocumented stabilization labor would continue existing indefinitely at no structural cost. Every emergency adjustment, every overnight coordination sequence, every unofficial recovery procedure slowly concentrated institutional dependency into one operational layer. Me. The colonel remained still for several seconds after hearing that explanation. Then he asked quietly, "Did you warn leadership about this previously?" I almost laughed. Instead, I answered calmly. Repeatedly. Back at Blackridge, the executive atmosphere reportedly shifted from frustration into visible fear by mid-morning. Another federal escalation notice arrived requesting immediate operational continuity assurances before upcoming contract renewal reviews scheduled later that quarter. Renewal reviews. That phrase terrifies executives more than lawsuits sometimes, because future federal money depends heavily on perceived reliability. And reliability disappears quickly once oversight offices detect unstable operational leadership beneath critical manufacturing systems. Around 11:30, Evan Mercer requested an in-person meeting. Neutral location. No executives present. Just him and me inside a small waterfront restaurant overlooking Commencement Bay under cold steel-colored skies. Interesting choice. He wanted privacy because power structures collapse more quietly once executives stop performing confidence publicly. When I arrived, he already looked different from the man sitting across from me during the promotion meeting 5 days earlier. Less polished, less certain. Operational pressure strips presentation layers off people fast. He spoke first. "Preston, we underestimated how interconnected your role actually was." Actually was. Still avoiding the real wording. Essential. I stirred my coffee slowly before responding. "No, you underestimated the cost of replacing judgment with management theory." His jaw tightened slightly. Small reaction. Quick recovery. Then came the sentence I had been waiting for since this started. "What would it take for you to stabilize operations again? Not help. Not advise. Stabilize." Language reveals hierarchy shifts before organizations admit them formally. I answered without hesitation. Operational authority. Direct reporting access above executive interference. Structural reform control. He stared at me carefully across the table while rain moved against the harbor windows behind us. Then I added the part he least expected. "And your position remains unchanged." That caught him off guard immediately. Because executives preparing for retaliation understand conflict. They do not understand disciplined restraint. I was never interested in humiliation. Only correction. The company did not need another ego battle upstairs. It needed reality restored downstairs. Evan leaned back slowly. "You would keep me in place after this?" I held eye contact evenly. Leaders learn more from surviving failure than escaping it. Long silence followed. Not hostile. Heavy. For the first time since my promotion denial, Evan Mercer finally looked less like a corporate strategist and more like a man realizing the systems underneath his authority had always been held together by people he never truly saw clearly. Then my phone vibrated once against the table. "Lena Park." Short message. "Federal oversight team arriving on-site tomorrow morning. Full operational review authorized." I looked up toward Evan calmly, then delivered the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. "You are out of time now." The federal convoy arrived Tuesday at 6:58 in the morning. 3 black government vehicles rolling through rain across the front security gate, while production crews inside Blackridge Defense already struggled through another unstable calibration cycle under reduced sequencing efficiency. Nobody on the floor missed the symbolism. When military oversight arrives before sunrise, the situation has already moved beyond internal damage control. Inside the executive conference room, the atmosphere felt compressed. Thick silence. Coffee gone cold. Laptop screens glowing across exhausted faces beneath sterile overhead lighting. No presentation decks anymore. No corporate optimism. Just exposure. Colonel Raymond Davis entered first carrying a slim operations binder beneath one arm, while 2 federal contract auditors followed quietly behind him. No raised voices. No intimidation tactics. People with real authority rarely need theater. Evan Mercer stood near the far side of the room beside the production director, attempting controlled professionalism despite visible exhaustion around his eyes. Lena Park remained seated near the compliance files already arranged chronologically across the table. Preparation matters, especially when institutions start protecting themselves. The colonel took his seat calmly before speaking. "We are here to assess operational continuity risk tied to ongoing fulfillment instability affecting active Army logistics contracts." Direct language. Military language. Then his attention shifted toward Evan immediately, who currently maintains cross-functional stabilization authority inside your production environment. Bad question. Not because it lacked an answer, because everyone inside the room already knew the truthful answer would damage executive credibility permanently. Evan hesitated slightly before responding. Operational responsibilities are distributed across multiple leadership structures now. The colonel remained expressionless. Then he asked another question without changing tone. Who resolved the majority of overnight synchronization conflicts before last week? Longer silence this time, because reality was cornering the room carefully, one factual layer at a time. Finally, Lena spoke instead. Preston Hale handled the majority of undocumented stabilization interventions personally for approximately 8 years. No emotion, only evidence. The colonel nodded once slowly. Then he opened the operations binder in front of him and began reading timestamps from recent escalation reports. 74 unresolved maintenance extensions, 3 federal shipment timing deviations, 2 failed overnight recovery sequences, 1 contract confidence review initiated. Every incident occurred within 6 days of operational dependency removal. He closed the binder quietly afterward, then asked the question that destroyed the remaining illusion completely. Why was a critical operational dependency allowed to remain undocumented? Nobody answered. Not immediately, because the truthful answer sounded unforgivable once spoken aloud in federal review conditions. The company optimized labor cost structures around invisible overtime dependency while pretending institutional resilience existed independently from the individual carrying it. That was the truth. Evan finally attempted recovery carefully. We believe the operational knowledge transfer process had been sufficiently distributed. The colonel turned toward him slowly. Believed based on what verification? No answer. Only silence again. That was the exact moment power shifted irreversibly inside Blackridge Defense. Not emotionally, structurally. Because once leadership cannot explain operational reality under federal scrutiny, authority starts collapsing beneath them whether titles remain unchanged or not. Around 10:15, the oversight team requested direct production floor inspection access. That changed everything further. Conference rooms protect executives. Factory floors expose them. The moment Colonel Mercer stepped onto Building 3 beneath flashing warning indicators and uneven conveyor pacing, he immediately noticed what leadership had ignored for years. Operators bypassing delays manually. Technicians improvising communication between departments. Supervisors solving process gaps informally without centralized coordination. Human compensation everywhere. Invisible strain holding together official systems that looked efficient only on paper. The colonel stopped beside one exhausted robotics technician reviewing unstable sequencing diagnostics, who normally coordinates stabilization recovery during drift escalation. The technician answered instantly without even looking up from the screen. Preston. No hesitation. That answer repeated itself throughout the entire inspection. Different departments. Same response. Preston handles that. Preston usually catches this first. Preston normally bridges the teams during surge failures. The organization had accidentally built operational mythology around one person while executives upstairs called him non-strategic. Interesting mistake. By early afternoon, the oversight review concluded privately inside the executive boardroom. Rain hammered against the upper windows while the factory underneath continued drifting through unstable production rhythm. Colonel Mercer stood near the end of the table reviewing final notes silently before speaking. Blackridge Defense does not currently have a machinery problem. The room remained frozen. Then he delivered the sentence nobody upstairs wanted recorded officially. You have a leadership comprehension problem. Tuesday night felt strangely quiet inside Blackridge Defense. Not stable, just humbled. The factory still struggled through synchronization drift and delayed maintenance recovery cycles, but something more important had changed after the federal inspection earlier that afternoon. The illusion was gone. Everyone now understood the same truth simultaneously. The systems had never been self-sustaining. They had been carried. And once an organization loses the ability to pretend otherwise, every conversation inside leadership changes tone permanently. At 7:14 that evening, I walked back through the main production entrance for the first time since the operational collapse began escalating publicly. Security personnel nodded differently now. Supervisors stopped speaking once I passed. Technicians watched silently from maintenance stations illuminated by pale industrial lighting and rotating diagnostic displays. Not fear. Recognition. There is a specific atmosphere inside operational environments when workers realize leadership finally understands who actually protects the institution daily. It feels heavier, more honest. The emergency executive meeting started 20 minutes later inside the same conference room where my promotion denial happened less than a week earlier. Same glass walls, same polished table, same Seattle skyline rain pressing against the upper windows. Completely different power structure. Colonel Raymond Davis remained present beside federal auditors, while senior executives reviewed projected contract damage exposure tied to continued instability. Estimated penalties, delayed renewals, production reliability risk scoring. Millions everywhere. Interesting how quickly invisible labor becomes financially visible once it disappears. Evan Mercer looked exhausted beneath the conference lighting. Not defeated, just stripped of illusion finally. The company president spoke first. Mr. Hale, we are prepared to discuss immediate leadership restructuring measures necessary to stabilize operations moving forward. Translation again. Panic with executive vocabulary wrapped around it. I stayed still for several seconds before answering. The organization does not need panic restructuring. It needs operational realism. Nobody interrupted. That mattered. For the first time since this began, the room stopped treating operational knowledge like secondary support beneath executive authority. Now it was the center of gravity entirely. I slid a printed document across the table calmly. Operational Recovery Framework. 3 sections. Mandatory Documentation Reform. Cross-Functional Stabilization Authority. Institutional Dependency Reduction over 18 months. No emotional language. No revenge demands. Just structure. The company president scanned the pages slowly, then looked up. You prepared this already? I nodded once. Years ago. Another silence. Because everyone understood what that meant immediately. I had warned them long before the collapse began. They simply preferred optimism over infrastructure discipline. Evan finally spoke quietly from across the table. You expected this to happen eventually. I answered carefully. I expected the risk to compound eventually. Important distinction. I never wanted the company to fail. I wanted leadership to stop confusing sacrifice with scalability. The colonel leaned back slightly while reviewing the recovery framework beside the federal auditors. Then he delivered the sentence that finalized everything operationally. This is the first stabilization plan we have reviewed all week that reflects actual manufacturing conditions instead of executive theory. That sentence landed harder than any formal reprimand could have. Because public embarrassment fades eventually. Professional exposure does not. The company president closed the document carefully before speaking again. Preston, we are offering you full authority as head of operational systems effective immediately. Direct reporting access to executive leadership. Compensation restructuring at $240,000 annually plus retention incentives. Full procedural reform authority across production stabilization. The room remained perfectly still afterward. Waiting. Not for negotiation. For judgment. I looked toward Evan briefly. Then toward the production floor visible through distant glass panels beneath cold factory lighting where exhausted teams still worked through unstable sequencing recovery cycles. That was the real reason I stayed calm through all of this. The workers were never the problem. They had been surviving executive blindness the same way I had for years. Finally, I answered. I will accept under one condition. The president straightened immediately. Name it. I kept my eyes on Evan while speaking. He stays. Confusion moved across the room instantly. Not because the condition lacked logic. Because nobody expected restraint after leverage shifted completely. Evan stared at me silently for several seconds before asking the obvious question. Why? I answered without hesitation. Because institutions improve faster when failure remains visible. The room fell quiet again. And somewhere underneath the building, for the first time in almost a week, the production lines finally started moving in rhythm again. 9 months later, the factory sounded different. Balanced. Clean rhythm. Steady conveyor pacing rolling beneath white industrial lighting, while synchronized robotics moved through calibrated production cycles without the constant hidden corrections that once depended entirely on exhausted human improvisation. Blackridge Defense still manufactured the same military transport systems outside Tacoma. Same buildings. Same loading docks. Same federal contracts. Different institution. That was the real outcome. Not revenge. Correction. The Operational Recovery Division now occupied the entire third floor above Building 2. Cross-functional stabilization teams, documentation architecture specialists, mechanical software integration coordinators, federal compliance analysts working directly beside production engineers instead of inside isolated executive silos. For the first time in company history, invisible labor became visible infrastructure. That mattered more than my promotion ever did. The transition took months. Long nights. Resistance from middle management. Endless documentation recovery. Hundreds of undocumented processes rewritten into structured operational continuity frameworks capable of surviving leadership turnover without collapsing into dependency concentration again. Slow work. Necessary work. The company president once asked me privately why I pushed documentation reform harder than compensation negotiations during restructuring. Simple answer. People burn out faster when institutions depend on sacrifice instead of systems. He never argued after that. Most interesting change happened inside executive behavior itself. Especially Evan Mercer. He stayed exactly where I requested. Same office. Same title. Same authority level formally. Different posture entirely. Operational collapse had stripped away the illusion that leadership meant controlling people through vocabulary and presentation confidence alone. Now he spent hours weekly on the production floor learning stabilization realities directly from mechanics, systems engineers, maintenance supervisors, and compliance coordinators previously invisible to executive strategy discussions. Humility changed him faster than punishment ever could have. One afternoon during quarterly contract review preparations, he stopped beside my office overlooking Building 3 while technicians below coordinated a surge production cycle smoothly beneath pale, fluorescent light. He stood there silently for several seconds before speaking. I thought leadership meant having answers immediately. I kept reviewing shipment stability reports without looking up. And now? Small pause. Then he answered quietly. Now I think leadership means understanding what keeps failing quietly before everyone else notices. Better answer. Not perfect. Better. Meanwhile, federal oversight pressure eased gradually once operational reliability stabilized above required thresholds again. The Army contract renewal cleared successfully 6 months ahead of schedule after independent auditors reviewed the new continuity structures and dependency reduction framework implemented across the organization. Colonel Raymond Davis attended the final review personally. Afterward, he walked beside me through the production floor while synchronized transport assemblies moved overhead in perfect timing. No warning lights. No emergency pacing. No hidden panic buried underneath polished executive reports. The colonel studied the factory quietly before speaking. You rebuilt the place without tearing anyone apart. Interesting observation. Because most people misunderstand power completely. They think strength means destruction. Real strength means remaining disciplined enough to repair what ego almost ruined. I answered carefully. The workers deserved stability more than the executives deserved humiliation. He nodded once. Military men understand that logic instinctively. Later that evening, I stayed alone inside Building 3 after most shifts ended. The massive production floor stretched beneath dimmed industrial lighting while automated systems moved steadily through overnight sequencing cycles with controlled precision. For years, I believed leadership meant carrying impossible weight silently until exhaustion became identity. That was the mistake. Organizations do not become stronger when competent people absorb unlimited dysfunction quietly. They become addicted to exploitation disguised as dedication. And eventually the institution forgets the difference between support and sacrifice completely. I looked across the factory one final time before shutting down the observation terminal beside the glass overlooking the floor below. The systems were stable now. Not because one man worked himself into the ground protecting everyone secretly. Because the truth finally became impossible for leadership to ignore. Interesting thing about invisible labor. The moment it disappears, institutions finally discover what was holding them together the entire time.